Aloha mai kako. In this week's module, we're asking the question, how do we know what we know? In module 1, you were asked to think about what assumptions you are bringing to this class. And in this module, we're going to flip that and ask what theories and assumptions do the scholars we're reading bring to the field of Indigenous political thought. And you have probably spent most of your time at university learning theory, the why and how of the way things work in whatever discipline you've chosen to study. In social sciences and natural sciences, you observe, ask questions about what you observe, formulate a hypothesis, and analyze, develop an experiment to prove your hypothesis, and analyze the results and draw some conclusions. Humanities and the creative arts also have criteria to determine what are worthy human achievements and what is aesthetically valuable. All these endeavors depend on theory and methodology. You also, for the most part, have been taught through the lens of Western civilization, in which theory and methodology assume that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement, and all others will someday catch up or perish. In your reading this week, the introduction in Chapter 1 of Decolonizing Methodologies, Linda Tuhivai-Smith demonstrates that this approach has been a problem for Indigenous peoples since our very first encounters with Westerners. As she writes, Indigenous peoples have been in many ways oppressed by theory. Any consideration of the ways our origins have been examined, our histories recounted, our arts analyzed, our cultures dissected, measured, torn apart, and distorted back to us will suggest that theories have not looked sympathetically or ethically at us. It's not that there is something inherently wrong with Western knowledge production, the scientific method, and theory making. The problem is that Western civilization divides the world into those who can theorize and those who must be theorized about. One of the supposed characteristics of primitive peoples, Tuhivai writes, was that we could not use our minds or intellects. We could not invent things. We could not create institutions or history. We could not imagine. We could not produce anything of value. We did not know how to use land and other resources from the natural world, and we did not practice the arts of civilization. By lacking such virtues, we disqualified ourselves. We did not just from civilization, but from humanity itself. In other words, we were not fully human. Some of us were not even considered partially human. To counter this argument, we need only to look at books like Theorizing Native Studies, which contains essays from 10 of our contemporary Indigenous scholars. In their introduction to the book, Audra Simpson and Andrea Smith talk about demystifying Western conceptions of knowledge production. It's clear, they argue, that all peoples do theory and that not all theoretical production is captured within the confines of academic learning. As they write, important theorizing is happening in Native communities, creating different forms of theorization that produce forms of analysis that take up political issues in ways that have important consequences for communities of every sort. Decolonizing methodologies began as a work for Indigenous scholars, students, and activists who wanted to develop research that was meaningful to their communities. People like Linda Tuhivai-Smith, who's Maori, and myself, who's Kanaka Maoli, were looking to find an academic identity that sat well with our strong Indigenous identity. to draw together a literature that spoke to the Indigenous condition on local, national, and global levels, and to develop ideas and resources that would assist the development of our own communities. The agenda for research comes out of a distrust of the white foreigners coming to research the native in the wake of conquest. Research was a dirty word in the Indigenous communities that we'll be studying this quarter because, as Tuhiwai Smith writes, research was something that was done to people by outsiders, and that had no positive outcome for the Indigenous peoples. Tuhiwai Smith's introduction is a deeply personal account of Western domination. She describes her childhood growing up within Indigenous communities where stories about research, and particularly about researchers, the human carriers of research, were intertwined with stories about all other forms of colonization and injustice. These were cautionary tales where the surface story was not as important as the underlying examples of cultural protocols broken, values negated, small tests failed, and key people ignored. Tuhiwai Smith goes on to tell us that the danger of this research was in the creeping policies that intruded into every aspect of their lives, legitimated by research, informed more often than not by ideology. In chapter 1, Tuhiwai Smith describes research as a part of the colonial project to build empire. She discusses the manner in which imperialism, history, writing, and theory shape contemporary perceptions of Indigenous peoples. Imperialism as an idea emerges in the Age of Enlightenment, a period in Europe of great social upheaval. Three crucial innovations during this time enabled imperialism. The three innovations are the nation-state system, the theory of progress as the principal way of conceptualizing social time, and above all, the idea of modern scientific rationality as the ultimate organizing principle and source of legitimacy in modern society. In other words, the nation state becomes authority and disciplinary power that ensures progress through knowledge production by means of scientific rationality, and these innovations are embodied in the imperial imagination. As Tuhiwai Smith writes, the imperial imagination enabled European nations to imagine the possibility that new world, new wealth, and new possessions existed that could be discovered and controlled. The imagination was realized through the promotion of science, economic expansion, and political practice. And one of the main questions of this class is, how do colonized Indigenous peoples recover their sense of authentic humanity that was stolen from them, along with land and resources, as Europeans moved across the world? A big part of the answer is education in both Western academic knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems. This is why Tuhiwai Smith spends the time to discuss the effects of imperialism, history, and writing and theory on Indigenous peoples. And this is why we are spending time reading this and providing some really important perspective on how we're going to connect our class. So in this introduction to the reading, I've posed a number of questions that I want you to pay particular attention to as you prepare for the discussion of this reading. From the introduction, who are Indigenous peoples? Why is the term Indigenous problematic? How is knowledge transmitted orally? Why is this form of knowledge transmission important to Indigenous societies? From chapter 1, what does Smith mean by colonialism is imperialism's outpost? What role does history play in Indigenous attempts to reclaim land, language, knowledge, and sovereignty? And why is writing important for Indigenous peoples? I'm sure that this week's reading is going to inspire many more insights and questions about the Indigenous critique of Western knowledge production. Please post your insights and questions to the discussion board before class. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.